recorded. The American woman has spoken, so we shall begin, and off we go. So for those of you who haven't been with PQTs before or done PQTs before, it's really easy. It is whatever comes into your heads in terms of questions for the planner. That's me, according to the shirt anyway. And it's whatever comes into my my head that comes back. PQTs is off the cuff, instant answers to as many instant questions that we can get through, and we're with you for an hour. So it is a case of over to you. Unmute yourselves, chat away, go. And no one talks. That's the fun thing with PQTs.
I'll start off with one for you, John.
Go for it, Chris.
It will be coming to you. It's a friend of mine.
Asking for a friend then.
Asking for a friend. Asking for a client. A potential one of your new clients. They have a house down in Almoddington, which is Selsey Bill.
Right, yeah.
I did a scheme for some housing along there a few years ago, found Chichester District Council particularly difficult, and the local parish council even more difficult.
Right.
They have managed to, over the course of a few years, get a bungalow, do it up, create a garage next to it, get current planning permission for the garage, double garage, and a workshop at the rear. They now want to increase it in size and convert it to a granny annex. Often this is not a legitimate thing. No, it's just a way of getting extra space, but I do know them very well, and they do have a granny there that desperately needs to use a bit of accommodation.
Okay. So the annexation route can take one of two forms, right? You can either apply for an annex. Now, most councils see relatively kindly when you apply for an annex. They understand, especially today, in today's modern world, that, you know, an annex is an important thing to have if you've got an aged relative. But then they will impose a nasty little condition on it that basically says, look, great, we'll give you an annex, but we're also going to make the annex revert back once granny or granddad shuffles off the mortal coil. That's one way of doing it. The alternative way of doing it is the not well, it's not illegal. It's basically just use of PD. So you follow the line of permitted development. So you get a garage or an outbuilding or whatever, and the important thing is you must use said item for a period of time. Now, the courts have ruled the planning test of significance is about 6 months or so.
All right.
And then once you've used it for that period, you can go back and say, hey, guys, I've got a grandma and she wants to live in the garage now. So can I annex it, please? Now, there's plenty of case law on annexation through this route. The courts have ruled that as long as it is legitimately an annex, and as long as granny or granddad has to return back to the house to perform a function, they have to still be part of the family unit, then it's okay. It's when they're not part of the family unit that it kind of breaks down a little bit, and you then have to apply for planning permission for something that's pseudo housing but not quite. So you can do it that way as well. But there are that's kind of the permitted development route of it all, and it's just basically arguing that it's not development because it doesn't amount to a material change of use, because it's incidental and ancillary to the use of the main body of the building. Really depends on how much risk your clients are feeling like taking on any given point in time, something that we do cover inside of the Victory Plan in terms of appetite for planning risk. And so it might be a case where they look at it and go, well, I don't really fancy taking this level of risk right now. I'll run the PD option, or I'm quite happy seeing what planning says, so run the planning option. One thing to be absolutely said is know thy authority. Chichester are backwards, sideways, and upside down, and they're going to take a very old world view, I think, of what you're trying to do. So you're going to have to really lay out what is going on, and try and spell it in words of less than one syllable.
But they in order to get it to work, they still want a garage, and they still want to extend because the current garage workshop area is not large enough to become an annex. So
Right.
there's an enlargement of it. Does that immediately mean that it's more of a planning thing than PD?
There is a risk that it does become more of a planning thing. So enlarging an outbuilding, the outbuilding as original must fall inside of permitted development in order to effect an enlargement to it. And if they got planning permission for the outbuilding, then that argues that they needed planning permission, and they needed planning permission for the enlargement.
They had planning permission for the outbuilding.
Yeah, so I would do that first.
And subsequent changes to that permission in order to raise the roof in order to get some accommodation up over the top of it.
Wow, okay, so yeah, I would probably attempt that first, get the extension done without the council getting a sniff of what's going on, and then run for the annex. That you're going to have to be very careful on how you phrase the application, however you pitch the application, because the if the council get wind that it's going to become an annex, they'll impose a condition saying you can have your extension, but no, you can't have an annex here. They'll do something nasty like it shall only be used, a condition like it shall only be used as a garage workshop and for no other purpose, without prior approval from local planning authority. So I'll impose that kind of rubbish condition, which is a nasty one to kind of argue against, because then you're arguing, well, actually, I wanted to make something more of what's there. There you go.
Okay, I'll have a word with them, and we'll be back in touch.
No worries. No worries. No worries. James, you put a question in the chat. So we'll read it out as is traditional with PQTs. You know, we sometimes hear from people, we sometimes read out questions in the chat. And yes, Durham are as backwards as Chichester. Speaking of Durham, John, seeing as ZA is quite new and cases a few, can you talk through your planning application and some of the pitfalls, hurdles and challenges? Oh my dear God. I've got another ZA to do at some point in time, and Liam's with us. Liam was the applicant on that ZA application up in County Durham. Oh,
that's hilarious. Ongoing, isn't it?
Goodness. It's the problem with ZA, as you rightly say, James, is it is far too new. Still far too new. No one's really been brave enough to push the limits of it, and no one's really been brave enough to absolutely hammer it. And when you get that way, you end up with being bereft of case law, being bereft of any real points to pick out. Now, there have been cases which have dealt with, for example, impact to street scene, etc. We've had a recent case, Cape Housing, which dealt with the impact to street scene question that's left behind inside of Part 20. You know, when does it have an impact, when does it not? But in terms of the other material considerations, what we found in the case that we dealt with is that we really had to lead the council by the nose. We had to take point by point by point in the design and planning statement that we sent over and lead them. It's not this because of this. It's not this because of this. And lo and behold, they defaulted back to the traditional realm of the planning officer, which is design and impact to amenity, which are the sort of safety nets for a planning officer, really. That's where they kind of like to be. And those were the bits that we had to overcome. But it was amazing. They didn't even understand the timescales. They hadn't worked out that they're not 56-day applications. They don't have a 56-day timescale on them. And in order to agree alterations to it, we had to educate them that there was no 56-day timescale. They weren't limited in the same way that you're limited under Part 3. Liam, do you want to add anything to that? Because I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah. We've got the reason we got the ZA was because we are in a greenbelt location. We need development in principle established, which we've now established. But we have to go back to the drawing board in order to get something that's going to be worthwhile as a holiday cottage unit on there, which we're going to do as a C3. But it will be operated as a holiday because it's our home property rather than any investment elsewhere. So it won't be rented. And obviously by that point, I'll have joined the RT. Well, I'm already a student member of RTPI, but by that point, I'll probably be qualified.
Well, we shall see. There are plenty of ways of skinning that cat, but yes. So that James is the summation. Really, they're still very, very new, very, very new indeed. And when you get something that's so new, you end up having to educate the council as much as anything else. There we go. Questions, please. We're only 15 minutes in. I know we're all brand spanking new to this again. It's been ages since I did one last. And I think it's
legislation,
hasn't it?
Legislation, but an academic-based question.
Go on then. Academic-based question.
So, what is the public perception of carbon neutral housing? What's the issue about the mass house builders building carbon neutral? What's stopping them? There's a
okay, great question. Very topical, especially as I sat through a seminar this morning on nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain, which makes carbon neutrality just look like a piece of flying arse. Right. So, why do house builders not do it? But I think the issue is that it's seen as a cop-out because they can go and buy carbon credit. Now, granted, when biodiversity net gain comes along, they'll be able to go and buy biodiversity credits. So it's just another form of credit banking. But ultimately, it's it's seen by the public as a bit of a cop-out because a developer can just go and buy a carbon credit from somewhere. They can go and grab carbon capture, or they can go and buy in products that purport to be carbon neutral, with the exception they take a horrendous amount of energy to actually make them. So to get to carbon neutral is quite difficult. But it's the fact that I think it's seen as a bit of a cop-out by members of the public. You know, it's a good way of getting your sustainability credentials up. Huh?
I think a legislative change needs to come then.
Well, the Environment Act, the brand new Environment Act, which starts to bite in next year, quite heavily next year, is the legislative change in effect, albeit it shifts focus. So instead of carbon neutral, we're moving to biodiversity net gain instead, where instead of trying to reduce your carbon emissions, what the government is trying to do is get developers to boost the biodiversity quotient of sites by a minimum of 10%. And that's the figure that's in the Environment Act. It's a 10% increase. I was sitting with colleagues today thinking about it and looking at it and going, well, in a city, 10% is all well and good. You know, that's relatively easy. How, you know, you've got hard urban environment with no biodiversity whatsoever. You know, not even bacteria choose to live in parts of Southampton. But especially a certain part, which I'm sure will get me banned from YouTube if I say it. But if you go out into the countryside where biodiversity is, let's say, everywhere, going 10% beyond that becomes increasingly more difficult. And it might very well change people's focus. I mean, see sites where someone shows me a whole raft of trees and say, right, I want to remove all these trees and put up a Taylor Wimpey estate.
Oh,
And I look at it and go, right, good. We're not going to be able to talk about this next year because biodiversity net gain is going to mean you've got to go 10% better than those trees that are there right now. And,
But
and
my issue is
the focus.
major house builders are chopping down whole sites. That's what I did for 10 years, Clearfield. And now, because I'm joining the other side of the thing, I'm like, we don't need to do that anymore.
No, that's the thing. That's the thing. But no, biodiversity is a game changer next year. It's going to be tough. It's not going to be fun. I've no idea how the council's going to deal with it because the councils are the responsible authority. They are the competent authority. And good luck to the county ecologist in each county because they're about to get a whole heap load of casework land on their desk. But ultimately, it's about a 10% improvement, which is really interesting because having negotiated sites in central London where we've purposefully, for example, chosen to put a garden in between buildings to put a bit of biodiversity in, the councils at the moment are saying, oh, no, we don't want that. We don't want gardens in between buildings. That doesn't make any sense to us. We like hard urban stuff. Next year, they're going to be saying, oh, we love gardens between buildings because it helps us tick the box.
John, does that mean that major developers or even smaller developers are going to start clearing sites this year just so that they get that problem out of the way?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because they must always be looking ahead, and the major developers will be looking ahead at what's coming. And they'll be looking at the Environment Act and going, right, have we done our biodiversity assessment on this site? Oh, right, it's like 1 million. It's got 1 million credits sitting on it right now because it's like a forest. Right, okay, let's make the forest disappear because we absolutely need to make the forest disappear to get our credits down to 0 because it's assessed at the point that the application is made, right? So it is going to encourage some environmental vandalism. We can see that happening in the private sector. That's just the way it's going to occur. It will catch some small developers out. And I think it will absolutely focus small developers' minds to brownfield land, I think, because suddenly their normal game plan goes completely out the window if they're being told, no, you need a 10% improvement over what you have right now. Yeah.
There are ways of increasing that though. There's lots of ways to increase that 10%, which they're not looking at right now.
No, I know. The current government mandated solution is for credit banks like Environment Bank and similar. And those credit banks will be setting aside land for 30 years, creating a net gain and selling you credits. And that's how it's going to work. James asks a question in the chat. Do you know of any councils that have adopted a similar style policy to the small site suburban intensification that Croydon famously and now infamously brought in? I really like how some of the low-rise density schemes that were coming through, but I missed the boat on that one. Actually, no. Is the simple answer, James. Croydon's small sites intensification was very much a political policy of the time, designed by the Labour administration in Croydon to, how do I say this again without getting banned? Sod it. I'll just say it. Evict Conservatives from houses and replace them with Labour voters in flats. And I've just got banned off YouTube. So there's been no attempt to repeat it. And there's a really simple reason why. It was a cataclysmic error in judgment. All it did in reality was encourage everyone and their dog and their cat and their grandmother to go and buy sites in Croydon, knock down housing and replace it with small blocks of flats. That created a massive peak in supply for one or two different types of dwelling, and a massive trough in supply for 3-bedroom dwellings in Croydon. Croydon still have the policy, but it's being dramatically phased out, and in reality they'll now encourage you to build 3-bed. They won't encourage you to go anywhere near 1 and 2, because let's face it, they don't need 1 and 2 bed at all. Interestingly enough, if you want to do an HMO in Croydon, aim for a 1 or 2 bedroom dwelling, because that's the hole in the policy. Croydon know they've got a problem with 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings, but they'd be happy if you take a 2-bed and convert it into a 3-bedroom HMO, because they don't need the 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings in Croydon anymore. They've got too many of the damn things. You try and touch a 3-bedroom house in Croydon for an HMO, you'll get absolutely crucified on appeal. But 2-bedroom flat into a 3-bedroom HMO, Croydon quite happy with that, even inside the Article 4 area. So that's just a different way of using property. But I hope that helps. James, right, where are we doing? We're 23 minutes in to this inaugural return of Planner's Question Time. Liam thinks Greenbelt legislation needs to be rewritten. I would agree, Liam. It's still dated from 1950, the Greenbelt Act of 1955. And it's the same tests. They haven't really changed. And they do need to be rewritten. They do need to be strengthened in certain places and weakened out in certain places to make the Greenbelt work a bit better. Because otherwise you just end up where we all end up, which is fighting a council for no good reason.
We could say that anything within 25-minute walk, as long as it's not any AONB or got scientific interest, why is it not being looked at in terms of being released in certain areas, like for instance the Metropolitan Greenbelt is a good example.
And Greenbelt does get released in certain areas. That does happen. That's part of the local plan review. But the council have to make a very good case for it. And yeah, I would agree. The Met Greenbelt in particular is huge and needs some loosening in certain areas to make it make a bit more sense. There are too many settlements with panhandles and divots in them where the boundary was drawn in a certain place at a certain time. And really, if you filled in that panhandle, you really wouldn't be making any difference at all. Nothing really would occur. So yeah, it's one of those where it needs to be done. Will it be done? Don't know. Do we know anything about this government at the moment? Not really. Aside from the fact that they like making statements that shake the market to its very core. And
I'm just trying to find an area I can specialize in, because the other day we're having a lecture off the guy who's in charge of the PhDs.
Right, yeah.
And he's like, oh, we'll pay your fees and we'll give you 16 grand a year if you get one of them tax free.
Okay, that's good. I'd love to do a PhD. I just don't want to travel all the way up to Newcastle to do it.
I was like, yeah, I'll do one of them.
Good. James, next question from him. Did we lose the ability to convert back a retail to resi? I guess Class E superseded it, but what about on the high street where they wouldn't want you converting E to resi to ruin the primary frontage, but the shop is too deep? Have we lost it? No, we haven't. We absolutely haven't lost that PD allowance. The test only affects shops on the high street that are in a conservation area, and that's where the test got changed. So in M, the old test was, oh, that was something interesting. In M, the old test was impact to the sustainability of the high street or the key shopping area, right? E doesn't have that test anymore. Really just doesn't have that test anymore. Instead, in E, the test, or in MA, the test is impact to the sustainability of the conservation area. That's assuming your shop is in the conservation area. Now, what you do have to do is ensure that the area that you seek to convert has been vacant for the requisite 3-month period. That's the gaming condition. I've had a recent case. In fact, I've had 2 recent cases where in one instance, the applicant at appeal decided that it was in their best interest, but not the interest of their case, to rent the shop unit during the course of the appeal. Genius. That completely screwed the 3-month time code, didn't it now? And then I've had another applicant off the back of a decision decide that in order to prove it's an office, he must rent it as an office. Genius. That's just screwed the time code there as well, hasn't it now? So that's what you have to worry about, is the area in which you convert has to have been vacant for this requisite period of 3 months. But if you can prove that, James, then you can still do it. It is most definitely possible. I hope that helps. Right, we're about half an hour in. There aren't many of us online tonight, but I wasn't anticipating many because it was sort of a, hey, we're doing this now. Let's do it again, and hopefully we'll get some more next month joining us for Planners Question Time. But we're going to go whilst there are still questions. So questions away. That's the sound of a dog. It adds authenticity. I'm working at home tonight.
Barney.
That actually is Barney. Well done, Liam. That was Barney. Athena is there and she's about to make her presence felt, I think. Yes.
Barney's in trouble, isn't he?
Barney is in a lot of trouble this evening with Mrs. McDermott, who came home and found that Barney's brand spanking new bed had been liberally sprayed. James asked, did you get around to unpicking the ministerial statement after Victory 1? Were there any juicy angles that tickled your feathers? No, with one exception. And it was interesting because I kind of spotted what it was. And then another sort of planning writer on his blog, Simon City's blog, spotted what it was as well. So investment zones. Investment zones was the tickle in the ivory, as it were, to in terms of, you know, an idea by government. What I and Simon City spotted is nothing more than a rehash. It is a rebaked, reworked, re-engineered version of something we've had for many, many, many years, all the way back since the 70s, that are still in legislation. And that is the idea of simplified planning zones. So we've had simplified planning zones for a while. They came in the 70s. They gave us great developments like Canary Wharf. And they don't generate good planning. They just generate stuff. But that is what the investment zones are. They're a rehash, a rebadge, a relabel of simplified planning zones. And what we're likely to see as different authorities come up and ask for their own simplified planning zone or investment zone, whatever you want to call them, is new, effectively broad reaching consents, which are how simplified planning zones work. They grant like a master plan consent where you just have to tick boxes. That is how they're really going to work. Do I think we'll see the return of public centre development corporations? Yes, we may very well do so. We still have one. We have the legacy LDDC, the London Docklands Development Corporation, is still on the books. It still exists. But yes, that is what they are. Now, the 38 dogs adds authenticity. try to do this at home. You know, I'll do it at the office next month. The 38 authorities that have been asked, lo and behold, coincide perfectly. I'm really going to do this at home next month. Coincide the office next month. Coincide with the nitrate affected areas. Lo and behold. So all of the nitrate affected areas, literally every single one, the government produced a list of all of the councils they had reached out to. And if you look at the councils, they coincide precisely with the nitrate affected areas. So the areas that are at the moment under a ban. It's almost like they thought about it, people, isn't it?
Mhm.
So that is the reality of it. Simplified planning zones are coming back with a new title, a new badge, as it were. And yeah, that is where it is. Liam says, what are they going to do with places like Teesdale? Well, Teesside, the Tees Valley, and all of the authorities that are in the Tees Valley have all been asked, would you mind a simplified planning zone? But we're not calling them those because they had a bad rap. Investment zones, we're going to call them that because that's a good name. That's what's going to happen.
You think even as far as Teesdale then?
I
Even
reckon
though it's
so.
not. Yeah.
I reckon so. They'll stretch it as far as they can stretch it because it achieves multiple outcomes. It unlocks the nearly 100,000 new homes that are presently tied up due to nutrient neutrality. That's the current figure. That's not my figure. That's the figure that came out of my training this morning. Nearly 100,000. And
Is that an RTPI?
huh?
Is that RTPI course, was it?
No, it was we do CPD. Even as experienced consultants, we do CPD. We have to, and that was a webinar run through five Essex Place chambers. Very, very good firm, very reputable, but they're running a whole webinar series, which is very interesting, and it does help put my CPD points up. And the one today was in part on nutrient neutrality, and the current figure is 100,000. 100,000 new homes that are currently held. And that is ultimately what the big juicy item was inside of the ministerial statement, is these investment zones. That's what's exciting for planning. There we go. Any more questions? I don't propose we're going to go all the way to 8 o'clock on this one. I don't think there's enough questions to do that, but it's a good starter for 10. So we'll go for another 4 minutes. Anything more for anyone more?
I got a very quick one, John. Well, maybe.
All right, Chris.
What are the pitfalls of going for planning on splitting an existing house into two? The house has had a large 2-story side extension to it. And it's an end of a terrace, easy access, car parking at the back, tons of room for amenity space. On the surface, it looks as though it's straightforward, but I always get a little bit concerned that things that look very straightforward often aren't.
Yeah, and often the most simple application is the one that causes you the most strife. 2 houses or 2 flats?
2 houses.
Oh, vertical subdivision rather than a horizontal.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So the simple answer to that question is this. A, comes down to policy, what the local plan says, and B, it comes down to how effective the split is, right? So let me try and explain that. Policy first. You'll encounter one of three different types of policy that exist around the subject of subdivision, and they'll just talk generally about subdivision, right? You'll either have a space geared policy. Space geared policies are there, and they say, we want you to keep any house that's below a certain figure internal as originally constructed. So they normally float around the 110, 120, 130, 140 mark internal, which is the traditional sort of 2 up, 2 down terraced Victorian house, right? Anything bigger than that, they're fine. Or you'll have the 3-bedroom retention type policy. A 3-bedroom retention type policy basically says, we've got no problem with you subdividing this thing, but you have to leave a 3-bedroom when you're done. Kingston, Merton have that kind of arrangement where you must leave a 3-bedroom house when you're done. Or a 3-bedroom flat when you're done. Normally then goes on the ground floor if you're doing flats, or you make it work inside. The final is a null policy circumstance. There's no policy at all. They're probably the best to deal with, because then you're just dealing with the mechanics of the thing. Can the thing actually work? When you're subdividing a house cleanly as a cleave through the center rather than horizontally, you also then have to do all the design aspects of it. So I've seen some rather poor examples in my career where they were cleaved front to back. So you had a front house and a back house, and that never works very well. I mean, that's very northern, sort of Burnley-esque back-to-back terrace. But the problem is you leave a house with no garden or no usable garden. I saw one recently in Bognor where they were proposing to do that. It was a very bad idea. The alternative is the side to side, where you're then chopping off essentially a wider house into smaller components, and there you just want to make the thing fit. So you want to make the thing work visually within the street. It's then about where you put the second door, where you put the second set of windows, where the garden subdivision all goes. How does that kind of work? And you and I have worked on schemes like that in the past where we've been able to successfully get it through, even having to go through the inspector. So that comes back into to the mechanics of the situation, really. And going back to Liam's point, yeah, it's amazing. I always reflect that planning is like fashion, right? We tend to go round in circles, and we never really reinvent anything or invent anything new. We're just reinventing something that we've done before. So, for example, serviced accommodation of today is effectively the apart hotels of the 1970s. HMOs of today are the bedsits of the 1960s, albeit slightly done up. That kind of thing. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
you're welcome. Liam asks, what's the main issues with the Birmingham development plan for the perspective of developers? Actually, the Birmingham City Local Plan is fine. The problem in Birmingham is the people who operate the Birmingham City Local Plan. It's actually the people behind the desks. The plan is fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. The one caveat to that is their backland development stance, which is very heavy anti. They really, really hate backland. And they have an whole SPD on how to do it. And the SPD basically is a long persuasion of why you shouldn't do it in Birmingham. But here are some ways you can. That's how I find the Birmingham City Local Plan. It's actually quite good. The policies are easy to read. They're easy to engage with. The problem with policy well written is it has to be used by someone. And it's the people using it, unfortunately, that appear to be letting the side down a bit.
Gotta pick it apart.
It's worth picking apart, to be fair. It's a good local plan. I'm not going to get it really decent.
Just picked on that one, so
Yeah, no, it's really, really decent. Anything else for anyone else? Otherwise, we'll close this one out. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me for the sort of first one of the new season. I hope that has been useful to you all. I'll put the recording of this on the YouTube channel. That will go up at some point tonight. And then you can watch it back to your heart's content, as is your want. But thank you very much for participating in PQTs tonight, and we shall leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
See you later.
Cheers.
Bye.